As we know from our course concepts, part of becoming an effective technical communicator means learning how to create a number of different kinds of texts. So figuring out what format that text has to take, what type, that sort of thing. We also know that those texts can be gathered together, collected, and put underneath broader umbrellas of concepts or categorized together. And we refer to those categories as genre. We know too that there are conventions that apply to not only genre, but then to the specific texts themselves. So the conventions are the sets of rules or the guidelines that essentially dictate or control or influence the way that we would construct a text. So for example, when we're talking about genre, we may have a broad category of proposals and reports. That's the broader category. They may share some similarities. There's a general sense of what goes into something that is a proposal or anything that is a report. But if we drill in more specifically to the format or the type, and we think about then what a technical proposal needs to do, that has even further conventions that would dictate how we would write that. And the same is true with something like a primary research report or a review, something like that. So when we're thinking about the expectations of our work, what we have to put together, we should really pay attention to what the conventions are for that particular kind of work. In our first assignment, we're looking at wikiHow, and in that assignment, we have to include things like technical definitions, descriptions, and ultimately it's the directions or the instructions. And again, there's lots of reading in our Canvas site that's already been assigned. You can go back to and reread it and look at it again to get a better sense. But what we really need to take away from thinking through conventions and genre is that even if we don't know how to write a particular thing, so if we don't know how to write a wikiHow article using definitions and descriptions, what we need to do is then look at a number of examples that we know to be effective. In other words, they're published in this case, or we have some other evidence that says that they are effective. And we need to analyze those texts to determine what makes them work, what makes them effective, what makes them meet the determined conventions and so on. So we are certainly looking for writing related things like spelling, grammar, punctuation, capitalizations, formality, vocabulary, that sort of thing. But we're also going to look for other elements like the use of color or not, font, what size font, what style of font, how many fonts, what color, what colors, graphs or charts, the layout, how is it designed? We might look for things like hyperlinks, the inclusion of photographs or videos or something else. So we're taking a look at what patterns are established. If we take a look at multiple examples, what do we see across those examples? Quickly, moving on to, or going back, I should say, to some of our reading. If we think about what technical instructions need to do, we're going to pull in our concepts from the course and apply those to what's happening in wikiHow. So this chapter on instructions that comes from our text open technical communication, if we see how they're describing or defining writing instructions, they're talking about step-by-step explanations. They mention words like assemble, operate, repair, do routine maintenance. They have the word build. And if we go through, we can see other verbs that they're using that are very much tied to step-by-step or sequential tasks, things that we would instruct an audience to do. Do this first, do this second, do this third. And so if you take a look at the other readings that are, again, posted on a Canvas site, you will see some of them have even further explanation and a bit more detail, even more specific ways of dividing these types of things out. So let's move forward then to doing some analysis with wikiHow. I'm going to look at 4 different articles and just look for some commonalities across them, but also to see ways that they are laid out, what's explained, the use of bullets, any of that sort of thing. So the first thing is wikiHow has a template. So things that we put in, it's going to automatically create a title, or it's going to put things in bold or in green or something else. So we don't have a lot of control over that. But we can also take a look at maybe how they've, like what the images look like or the visuals look like. So if we're adding our own, does it fit with the way things look overall for the site? So there's some stuff we don't have any control over, but there's a lot that we do. But also taking a look at what their specific rules are, what their expectations are, or the patterns that we're going to see across the pages that helps us know what to put there and maybe think about how to write our text. So the first thing I'm going to point to is the title. We have in this one, how to use a multimeter, how to dry a tulip, how to make pasta vongole, and how to cook Creole red beans. What we should notice is that all of those titles start with how to, and they're followed by the verb. If we go back to the readings on technical instructions, we'll see a lot of these verbs are very similar. So use, make, cook. We don't have one that's on dry, but that's okay. We can understand that there's going to be variation to that, but it still gives us a step-by-step. You do this first, this second, this third. So how to use a multimeter, how to dry a tulip, and so on. If we then look below the title, we'll see that on each of these examples, there's a small blurb. It's a bit of a background. It helps set the stage. It helps introduce the topic overall, but it's also a place where the writer can perhaps introduce some kind of a definition. And again, we're thinking about what technical definitions do. It doesn't have to be a dictionary definition. Instead, we're putting boundaries around it. What is it? We're thinking of descriptions. What is this? What does it look like? Where did it come from? Anything like that. So in this particular example, we see a multimeter is an instrument and so on. That's a definition. Keep in mind that you may have definitions that show up elsewhere in your writing, but that introductory paragraph might be a good place to put one. In this one on how to dry a tulip, we don't have a definition there, but there could be something like, what do we mean by drying a flower? What does that actually mean? Does it preserve it? Does it do something else? So that could be a place to put in a definition. If we look at some of these other ones, for example, here's this one on making pasta vongole. It describes a bit what it is. It translates the word to clam. So vongole means clam. And it tells us that it originated in Naples. There's room here for maybe a little bit more, but in terms of the shortness of this intro, it fits within wikiHow conventions. So there's a part of it's translating a little bit, it's giving some description, giving us a history. With the one on red beans, it places it with New Orleans and a few other things. So again, maybe not a clear-cut definition in some of these examples, but we're moving to that. We have descriptions. We have ways of making it much more rich than just, here's a dish, you should learn how to make it. Also coming back, if we look at this one on the multimeter, and we scroll down a little bit, we'll see that this is actually divided into parts. And so thinking about how to divide our tasks, one thing we have to do is figure out how many tasks the user needs to follow. But then can we split those tasks into categories or into parts? So in this case, we have part 1, getting familiar with the device. And if I scroll down, part 2, measuring resistance, and so on. If we then drill in a little bit farther to those individual categories, under getting familiar with the device, we then see the first step. It's numbered. And following that is the first thing that we tell our audience to do. Look very closely at how this is constructed. It starts with the verb that you're asking the audience to do first. Locate the dial on your multimeter. If we look down to instruction number 2, find. In this case, find the selector switch or knob. If we go down to number 3, locate. So here we are under getting familiar. We're just looking for things. So that makes sense to have those kinds of verbs fit under this particular category. If I look at the one on how to dry tulip, we have, instead of the parts that this one's divided into, we have methods. So here's the first method to dry a tulip. We could press it. And again, if we look at the conventions, step number 1, cut. There's the verb, and then what it is that we need to do. Cut the flower off the stem. Number 2, spread the flower head flat, etc. And so forth as we go down the page. Same thing is true if we go to some of these other examples. What we also will notice is that underneath the instruction, so we have the instruction that's listed again, verb first, and then what it is that they do, there is a bit more explanation following. Perhaps what if it says to put it on a piece of paper, it may explain what kind of paper. It might have a little bit further instruction about a way to do that. So if it says to spread the flower out, this case it says to set it on its head and push it flat. So we have the simple sentence, really it's a command, first as the instruction, followed by a little bit more detail about how to do that. Underneath that part, we see these bullets. And if we look a little more closely at parts that have additional bullets underneath the explanation, these sections tend to have additional information that is useful to know, or that can help make decisions or know what, know one thing from another. But if we got rid of those bullets, we would still know what to do, because the instructions are in that first sentence, or that first command: find the selector switch, or spread the flower head, that kind of thing. So we're looking at verb that starts the instruction, further explanation about what that could mean or look like, followed by some additional detail that may or may not have to be there, but it certainly is helpful to be there. But if it wasn't there, we would still know what to do. Something else we'll take a look at: if you have something that's like a recipe, and these last two examples are recipes, note that we have an ingredients list in both of these. So we have to start with that. If somebody's going to make a recipe, they have to have a list of ingredients. If you have a set of instructions that are about building something or making something, then you would include the supplies that the reader needs. What do we need up front before we even start the instructions? You'll note in this one on how to make pasta vongole, there's even an optional ingredient list. So this is what is needed, but this is what could be done instead, or in addition, or to swap out. Then we take a look at the steps. Again, same sort of thing. We have verbs: purge the clams, etc. Here's an example of a definition of what purging means. So it makes sense in this example to put the definition below the section where you're telling the audience to do that, rather than to put that definition in the introduction. This is one verb. So what does this mean? How does somebody purge a clam? That's important to know. And so on. Something else I'm going to point out is our use of visuals. In these first two examples of how to use a multimeter and how to dry a tulip, if we look pretty closely, they are instructional, as in demonstrating exactly what to do. We also have illustrations with labeling or parts of it that are identified. So these are drawings that point out particular parts of the object, or what angle to cut at, and that sort of thing. So they're very instructional in terms of their use on the article. They are not decorative only. So they're not just there, here's a picture of a tulip. They're actually showing us what to do. If we take a look at these two recipes, same thing. These are instructional in the way that they are presented. I'll jump in here quickly. The article on pasta vongole and the article on Creole red beans, these are both from students who have taken our class. They've taken technical writing before, and these were their contributions to wikiHow. Interestingly, the student who did this one on pasta, these are her images. So she understood what wikiHow was looking for in the conventions of what, not only the format of the image, but what should be in the image, how big the thing is, that she's demonstrating, simplicity in the actual image itself. wikiHow editors have kept all of her images. The example on Creole red beans, the images that are included with this are not the images that the student had posted originally. In fact, someone has come in now and actually added some video, which was not there before. So that is something that can happen with wikiHow. The editors can make choices. Other users on the site can make choices. But you have a higher likelihood of your work staying if you follow the conventions to begin with. The last thing I'm going to point out is this small set of numbers at the end of a section. What this refers to are references. So if you've used resources or outside information, you do need to cite it, and you need to cite it according to how wikiHow expects citations to work. So we have these small numbers that go to a link, and if we were to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, which I'm going to do kind of quickly, we will note that there are other references that are linked here below. So be sure that if you are using outside information, that you are also citing it. Those are some of the conventions.